All right, thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Raise your hand if you've ever gone swimming in the ocean. Yeah. Who doesn't love to go to the beach? What about a lake? Getting a little bit smaller. Okay. Public swimming pool. Cool. We've got some water enthusiasts. So there's this concept I first learned about a few years ago, and it's kind of psychologically weird, but it's been stuck in my head ever since I first heard about this. But basically the concept is that for any given body of water, there's a limit to the concentration of urine per gallon, beyond which the average person would no longer be comfortable swimming in that body of water. People have different thresholds, and that's fine. There's no judgment there. But everybody has that limit, and it exists. If you take the ocean, for example, most people here put their hands up saying they'd go swimming in the ocean. Everybody in the back of their heads kind of knows that cruise ships dump out all that human waste they collect from the toilets. Animals swim around and eat each other and defecate, and there's all sorts of nasty stuff in there. But the ocean is just so big, and there's so much water that you don't really have to worry about it. Even public swimming pools in your town, right? You just kind of hope that it's large enough and chlorinated enough that all the little kids that are swimming around next to you peeing in the pool don't affect the water that much. When it gets smaller than that, though, things start to get borderline. Like a hot tub, a shared hot tub at a hotel starts to get a little bit questionable if you'd go in there. I know I definitely wouldn't hop into a bathtub in a hotel room unless I knew that it had been drained and cleaned out before I get in there. The important part here is that there's a limit to all of this, even if it's different for every person. Once you get above that limit, it matters. And you can approach that slowly, and things change pretty quickly once you get close to that limit. So hey everyone, Kropes introduced me, but I'm Dan Lorenc. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Chainguard. And I'm not really here to talk about public sanitation in swimming pools. I'm here to talk about open source, and in particular, some of the attacks on it. Open source is under attack in a lot of different ways. I'm not talking about the nation states trying to slip malware into libraries to do ransomware attacks or steal data. I'm also not talking about all the folks DDoSing vulnerability management systems with false positive vulnerabilities, clogging up time and wasting everybody's precious resources. And I'm especially not going to talk about large companies all around the world building products and shipping things to their users built on open source software while they're making full use of the protections and guarantees afforded to them by the licenses inside. What I'm actually here to talk about is the gradual erosion of the very definition of open source and the effect that can have when people publish stuff under open source light or open source licenses, the effect that can have on the overall open source community and ecosystem. That amazing swimming pool that we're in today is getting gradually eroded. Every time someone does this and they publish software under a license, it's almost as good as open source, or it's open source, just one or two of the terms have been changed. Kind of see that as someone coming over and peeing in this amazing pool that we're all swimming in. At first, you might not notice if the pool is large. Depending on where you're swimming, it might even feel a little bit warmer at first. But over time, if this keeps happening, the pool's going to turn yellow and no one's going to want to swim in it anymore. So the main 2 points I want to make today is that open source needs help. Open source is a critical infrastructure, and the definition of open source is really important, and it needs our help, and it's worth defending. And the second one is that these licenses are actually fine. Anyone can publish software under any license they want to. It's their choice. But they're not open source, and we shouldn't allow people to commingle and pretend that they are, or that they're just as good. So for that first point, open source, I put this in quotes. I capitalized the O and I capitalized the S because that's really important here. Open source does have a very precise definition. Where this gets hard, though, in engineering, there's this term called the robustness principle. It's used a lot in designing standards for interconnected systems, and engineers typically try to use that principle when they're communicating. But it says that you should be generous in what you accept and conservative in what you send. That helps all these systems interoperate because the standards are a lot more flexible, it's easier to be fault tolerant and everything. But that doesn't work in open source. Open source actually has a very precise definition, and it's important that everyone understands what that definition is and that we reject things that don't meet that precise definition. So what I mean when I say open source has a precise definition, again, the capital O and the capital S here. Open source has been around for decades and decades and decades, but the term open source used in this context doesn't date back that far. It was actually coined in the late 90s. Before that, all of this that was happening was going on in the free software movement, and eventually this definition got formalized to try to make open source more friendly to businesses. It's governed by the OSI, or the Open Source Initiative, not a dictionary or any of these other formal bodies. The OSI, in true open source fashion, they're a nonprofit initiative, and they've been around since 1998. As they started to formalize this definition, again, in true open source fashion, they started with some others that already existed. In this case, it was the Debian Free Software Guidelines, which were guidelines around what packages could make their way into the Debian operating system. They tweaked it, they changed it, they've iterated on it over time. But what we have left today are really these 10 specific criteria. These are pretty long, and there's long paragraphs explaining the nuances to each of these. But if you evaluate these and run an open source license against these, you can determine whether it meets the criteria or not. Start with free distribution, source code, derived works, integrity of the author's source code, no discrimination against persons or groups, no discrimination against fields of endeavor, distribution of license. License must not be specific to a product. License must not restrict other software, and license must be technology neutral. When you combine all of these, you can tell if a license actually meets the definition for open source or not. Now, the interesting part here, like I said, the OSI is not a formal standards body. Nobody has to listen to them. But they do make these decisions. They operate in true open source fashion, again, on a mailing list. People submit new licenses to this mailing list for feedback. They get iterated, they get evaluated, they get clarified, and eventually they get approved or rejected by the OSI. But they're just kind of people on the internet at the end of the day. No one actually has to listen to them. They can't force you to use their definitions. That's kind of where the problem comes in. They can't stop other people from calling licenses that they've rejected open source. They depend on the public and the community to do that work for them and to defend it and to trust their definition. So in a way, they're kind of like the Santa Claus of open source because their power only exists if we all believe it does. If we all stop caring about their definition, then they just go back to a bunch of people on the internet on a mailing list. But fortunately, many people do believe in this definition. In particular, lawyers everywhere. Instead of lawyers having to review every open source license, they trust the work that these people do, and they trust and understand the protections that companies are granted when they use a license that does meet the open source criteria. And there's tremendous value in that definition. That's why we see it showing up in procurement contracts at big companies all over the world, in government regulations, even in new laws refer to things that meet open source criteria. Having shared criteria that everyone understands provides tremendous value. That's why developers around the world are free to use open source in some of the most sensitive environments out there. Because lawyers understand the licensing criteria, they don't need to review every single pull request. They don't need to approve every single package that a developer installs. If lawyers had to do that as you were writing code, it would cause tons of friction. Friction kills velocity, friction slows everything down, and the fact that developers can operate this way is what makes open source so ubiquitous, and it's what's allowed it to get everywhere around the world and power all of our critical infrastructure. That power, though, around that brand, everyone knowing and respecting that definition, causes problems too, though. As long as that definition exists and we all believe in it, and open source can continue to thrive. But because of all that power, that means that definition is under attack. People want their licenses to be approved, even if they don't meet that criteria. If we allow that brand and that definition to get weakened, or basically diluted with P in this case, we're going to lose the benefits that we've all grown accustomed to without having to know about or care about all of the different terms in these licenses. Developers are going to need to go into lengthy legal reviews every time they want to pull in a new library. Companies are going to be scared to publish things on the internet if they're not clear about the liabilities they're encountering when that source code becomes public. You might think of this as only a big company problem, but it's not. It's a shared problem. Everybody here that uses open source, and that's probably everyone in the room in some fashion, is going to be affected by this. Yeah, open source is developed by everyone, not just big companies, but all of the studies show that the majority of open source contributions come from people employed at companies, whether it's sponsored work or in their free time. If policies have to get in the way and if companies have to start worrying about the code that people are publishing, it's going to slow everything down. And if we lose or slow down that funnel of contributions from people, that could cause entire projects to stop being sustainable. It could cause entire projects to stop working. Security bugs aren't going to get fixed. Maintenance is going to get a lot harder. So to put this bluntly, if we can't all act together to keep preserving and to keep defending the definition of open source, the lawyers are going to have to come back. No one wants the lawyers to come back. No one wants lawyers watching them write code. Sorry to any lawyers in the room. We do love you. We just don't want you watching us write code. I'm stuck. There we go. So what's happening and why? Well, the kind of unfortunate truth here is that those 10 protections, those 10 criteria don't work for everyone. And that's fine. Every business and every project is different. I run a company today, and we think long and hard about what software that we're going to release under open source licenses. And we release a lot of software, and we don't release a lot of software. These criteria just don't apply in every single case. Another kind of unfortunate truth here, though, is that things change. Sometimes a business or a company releases something under an open source license, maybe without even fully understanding what they just did. Or maybe their business or the environment around them has changed, and that makes it so that the license doesn't work for them anymore. For whatever reason, though, we're seeing a lot of people take software that was under an open source license and relicense it to something that doesn't meet all of those protections. These licenses are not open source when that happens, though, and we can't let people argue that they're just as good or just as easy for people to use. Most of these problematic licenses start from an open source one too, and then they inject one or two extra clauses or poison pills around one or two of those protections, typically targeted at somebody that's competing with them or somebody that they might see as stealing the work that they've done when they contributed it under an open source license. When you zoom in, these are the clauses that typically get attacked. These are the ones that typically get removed from a open source or non-open source license. Things around free redistribution, no discrimination against persons or groups, or no discrimination against fields of endeavor. A lot of the licenses will add a clause around that says you're allowed to do anything you want with this as long as you don't compete with us, or as long as you don't run the software in a very specific way. And this doesn't work. It's not open source unless it meets all of this criteria. The real challenge here is the dependency graph and the interconnected nature of open source. The people doing this argue that these clauses should apply to so few people that it won't affect you, and it doesn't matter. As long as you're not taking their code to build a direct competitor to them, which you're probably not, it shouldn't affect you. You shouldn't have to worry. And then they hear all the backlash from the community around how this isn't open source anymore, and they get confused because why would anyone want to compete with them? The real problem here, though, is that everyone depends on software from everyone else. If you have a dependency graph full of thousands and thousands of packages, it's only a matter of time before something with a license in there that you can't use makes its way in, and that kills the entire project for you. And beyond just you, all of the other maintainers in that project that work for companies. Even if you don't compete with them directly, they might. It's going to start fracturing this dependency graph from this big shared pool that we can all use and swim in and collaborate in together into ones full of different pockets where you have to worry about who competes with who, and that's just unsustainable. The other major point here is that the healthiest open source projects, the biggest, the largest, the most sustainable, the healthiest open source projects work when they have direct competitors working together on them. This is the contribution graph for the Kubernetes project here. A lot of these companies compete directly with each other, but they can still find time to invest in this project together, even though they're competing somewhere else. Imagine if half of these companies couldn't contribute because of a clause in that license. The whole project would fall apart. One more example here, this is the Linux kernel. Same thing. This has been around forever, and companies have figured out a way to deal with contributions and deal with working with competitors. That's what open source is about. It brings us all together. If you want to take that thought experiment a little farther, just think about the companies you work for. Think about who you would consider a competitor. Think about the projects you work on and what would happen if all of those people just disappeared. You can take that another step further. What about somebody that you partner with? Who do they compete with? We're 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon away from blowing up the whole open source dependency graph if we let this happen. Everybody's seen kind of the iceberg analogy of open source where developers write 2 to 4% of code and they depend on 90+% of contributions from everyone else. That's awesome, it's beautiful, and that's the way that we can all work and innovate together. But if we have to fragment this into groups of who competes with who and who doesn't compete with who and whole different versions of dependencies, that iceberg is going to fall apart. It's going to fragment. It's going to melt a lot faster. Like I said before, these licenses are fine. You can do whatever you want with software you write and you contribute to, but you can't ride on the coattails of the open source definition and ride on that brand and try to get people to use your code without understanding the implications that's going to have on everything downstream of you. So if you're a maintainer of an open source project, be careful here. Don't let stuff that's not under an open source definition into your dependency tree. Don't let people pull these things in without realizing it. You're going to have to be vigilant because this keeps happening, and it only takes one of them to ruin the entire dependency tree for a project before somebody's not going to be able to use or contribute to your software anymore. Sure, 1 or 2 aren't going to matter, but as soon as enough of them make their way into that pool, we're going to quickly get to that limit where nobody's going to be safe, lawyers are going to come back, and it's going to get a lot harder to use open source now. So just to wrap this up, I keep saying these licenses are fine, and they are. We just want them somewhere else, and that's basically the call to action. Maybe I'll be wrong, and these licenses will take off, but we need people to go do that somewhere else, and there are some groups that are doing this, so I do want to thank them for it. The fair source license is one example of somebody that's doing this right, I think. They heard a lot of community feedback around trying to rebrand it as open source, and so they're trying to build up their own brand. Maybe I'll be wrong, and this stuff will take off, but they can't go pee in our pool, right? Open source is great, we understand what we're doing. Calling on them to go build their own pool and fill that with pee and see if anybody wants to swim in it with them. Let's just wrap this up. Thank you all for listening. This kind of nitpicking and parading on definitions can be incredibly tiresome and frustrating, and it can feel useless at times, kind of like the bathrooms at a public swimming pool. But a lot of people do put in a lot of work to preserve this definition. It took a lot of work to build up in the first place. And I want to thank everybody that does this publicly, Matthew Wilson, Steve O'Grady, all those people out there that push back and call out companies that are trying to steal the brand of open source. I hope everybody better understands the harm that this can cause to the overall ecosystem. So thanks for having me on here today, and thanks for listening to me talk about urinals.